How's it going, everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we're talking about quote-unquote rare or seldom talked about penguin classics. Now, the impetus for this video was another video that I saw about a week ago on exactly the same topic by Orpheus. If you haven't heard of Orpheus, he's another booktuber with, I would say, pretty excellent taste in world literature and poetry and that kind of thing. I'll leave a link to his video down below. And basically at the end of this video, he invited a response from other people to talk about some of the cool, maybe underappreciated, under-talked about penguin classics, or I'm actually also going to mention an Oxford classic in this video. And for me at least, it's not necessarily about like how expensive or hard to find some of these are. It's just that I, very seldomly hear them talked about, at least in like English speaking circles that I'm aware of. And it's kind of a shame in a lot of cases because I think there's some really interesting stuff here and some really beautiful stories, sometimes like famous stories from the respective countries that they come from. It's just that in an English translation, in the Penguin Classics edition, either it just isn't talked about very much anymore, it's out of print, or maybe newly in print and hasn't gotten a chance to really circulate and make an impression on the culture. And hey, maybe with this video we can turn that around. I can introduce you to some really awesome world literature that you've never heard of. So let's dive right into it. All right, so first of all, we have the Travels of Sir John Mandeville. Now, you may have seen this imagery before. I've seen people kind of post memes about this stuff. You got these human beings, I think that's what they are, with like faces on their chests and no heads. And this is very amusing. What this book is it belongs almost kind of to the same genre as the Travels of Marco Polo, or if you've heard of it, the Travels of Ibn Battuta. It's like these travelogue literatures where someone who did or who claims to have traveled a great distance comes back and they write a book about everything they see, right? It's like the medieval or even ancient version of like a travel log. From my understanding of Herodotus's histories, which I haven't read yet, there's even like elements of this genre in Herodotus, for example. And what you see with these strange creatures is that they often come back and report that they've seen, very, very mysterious creatures that you and I probably have never seen, right? Like, probably like Bigfoot and things like this. And I think it's kind of interesting. Now we look back at this probably as something kind of silly, and I haven't read this yet, but I don't think the accounts of, I could be wrong, but I don't think the accounts of Sir Mandeville are regarded like directly as completely factual. There might have been some embellishment going on, but kind of the idea is that whatever spiritualized mindset people had back in the Middle Ages, stuff like this wasn't understood by them as being as implausible as it would be to us. In a somewhat similar vein, we have Johannes Leo Africanus, or Al-Hasan ibn Muhammad al-Wazan, in his Cosmography and Geography of Africa. So I found this book randomly at like a new bookstore and I just thought it was interesting. So I bought it. Basically, from what I can gather, this fellow, Johannes Leo Africanus, formerly Al-Hasan, was, I think, born like maybe in like Morocco or something, and he ended up going on, many adventures, many travels, and he ends up in Italy where he converted to Christianity. He got this more, Latin European name and proceeded to write a book about what Africa was for a European audience. And to my understanding, based on like, kind of the blurbs in this book, it becomes like the standard understanding of Africa for Europeans until like the age of exploration. So like Shakespeare's understanding of what Africa might have been, would have been based on this book. I have no reason to think that this is like uniquely rare or anything, but I think that this edition is kind of advertised as like the first new translation of it in a while. So maybe before this edition, it's just one of those like obscure Latin, or I don't know, was it written in Latin? Either way, it's another entry in this, I think, really underrated and interesting genre of like these medieval and ancient geographies and travel narratives, or travel, what would you call them? Travelogues, travel writing. It's going to be less, whatever, scientific than how we would conduct these kinds of geographical discussions today, but it's also going to be less boring than like contemporary geography, where you're comparing like the square miles of a region, dividing it into certain biomes, and kind of going into some more scientific detail and then calling it a day. With some of these, I think you might get a little bit more of like the emotional and psychological experience of traveling from one land to the other and getting these different impressions. I think. I haven't read it though, so who knows. Okay, so next up we have some Korean literature, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody like mention either of these books before, and I think that's a shame, because for different reasons I think both of these texts are just amazing and entertaining and beautiful and fun. Kim Man-Jung's The Nine Cloud Dream is basically a spiritual epic poem, I think kind of like from the Buddhist perspective, which recounts the story of a monk who was kind of, traveling, doing an errand for his master, and he came across like these 8 beautiful women. And of course, he's a monk, he's sworn to be celibate and to be completely sober and everything. And he kind of like flirts with them briefly, and I forget if they really do anything other than like maybe share a drink together and joke around a bit. But when he gets back to his master, he's sinned. He's deviated from his path as a monk. And so as punishment, his master sends him to hell and has him be reborn to live another life and figure out whatever sinfulness is on his heart that he deviated from the path of a monk. And his punishment in this next life is basically to be reincarnated as the most handsome, capable, charismatic human being that there ever was. And then he goes around on these various adventures and meets in turn the reincarnations of each of these 8 women who he met on the road as a monk, and they each kind of in various ways become his wives and his concubines. And this is his punishment for sinning. Honestly, I feel like that sounds like a pretty good deal to me. If that's what hell is like, there goes, significant portions of the existential anxiety I might have otherwise felt. But in all seriousness, I think the ending of this story is really, really beautiful. The way that he, goes back to the life of a monk, having actually learned a lesson from this life. I think the idea is that, he realizes that having all of those worldly attainments fulfilled doesn't bring him any closer to his true goal as a monk, as a spiritual person. But that doesn't stop the text and the story from having a lot of really beautiful poetic fun along the way. I really, really, really love this story. I think that the cover art is super beautiful. Premise and the characters and everything is just, I don't know, it just makes me happy. I feel like it's really worth your time, really worth your effort if you want to read it. It's not like overly long or anything. And then I think if you like took it more seriously, it's also got like kind of like some depth from a religious and Buddhist perspective as well. The story of Hongil-dong is a little bit different. It's a little bit more of like a cartoonish, kind of as the cover implies, almost like more military focused epic poem. I haven't read this one as recently, so it's not as fresh in my mind, but it basically recounts the great deeds of this hero, Hongil-dong, and his establishment of like this really great kingdom. And for the most part, I feel like it's a little bit more cartoonish and like entertaining rather than spiritual as compared to the Nine Cloud Dream. However, I also think that there is kind of a themes surrounding filial piety throughout the story as well. And I think part of Hongil-dong's heroism is the fact that he like honors this virtue of filial piety. To my understanding, these stories, I think especially Hongil-dong, are frequently retold and frequently talked about in Korea. And so I think they're underrated. Okay, the Song of the Kieu. I've talked about this one before, so I won't dwell on it as much. It's another kind of epic poem, this time recounting the story of this young woman named Kieu. And basically it's almost like the opposite of the 9-cloud dream. Instead of living a life of luxury and accomplishment in marriage and politics and worldly success, the Song of the Kieu is a story about worldly suffering and failure. And every step that Kieu takes, some misfortune, some great suffering and sadness befalls her. And every time it looks like she might, somebody might be helping her out of this situation, she might have a ray of hope, then that person, betrays her or has to leave, and she is, left on her own to suffer or to be enslaved in like this brothel. I think there's a couple of different brothels she gets enslaved in. She falls in love a few times, and then these people have to leave or they betray her. But still, at the end, there is like a spiritual message and a gratifying takeaway. And what I noticed especially about this story as compared to the 2 Korean ones that we just looked at, and this might be partly about the translation as well, is that it was a lot more like delicately poetic and cinematic in the moment-to-moment description. I would say from the quality of like an English reader's experience of the moment-to-moment text, the Song of the Kieu might be the strongest, like linguistically, out of these 3 stories that we've just looked at: the 9-cloud dream, the story of Hong Gil-dong, and the Song of the Kieu. It almost reminded me of like reading Du Fu or something, but with an epic narrative woven into that. And so it was really, really beautiful to read. I absolutely recommend this, maybe even more than the other 2, even though I also kind of like the other 2 because they're more upbeat, they're more exciting. But yeah, really awesome stories all around. Next, we have Apuleius and the Golden Ass. Now, in comparison to some of the other ones, I don't think this is very uncommonly talked about or rare. I mean, it's like a Latin novel. I feel like that does have a bit of an audience in some of these like booktube circles. Certainly you can find more videos on YouTube discussing Apuleius and the Golden Ass than some of these other stories. But in specific, the edition of the Golden Ass that I have, for some reason, is completely like misprinted. And I'll try to pull up a video of it here. I forget which book it is that's like included twice, and it's also missing 1 or 2 books, and they're kind of all out of order and out of sync, so that I couldn't really read that edition. I kind of had to turn to an audiobook. I don't know. I just thought that was kind of funny. I don't know if that makes it super rare or worth anything. I feel like that would be counterintuitive. You actually like can't read this edition effectively of the Golden Ass, so I don't know why that would be sought after. But yeah, as frustrating as it can be, it can also be a little bit amusing to see some of these misprints. I think I also had a much more minor issue with a misprint of The Story of My Life by Giacomo Casanova. In that one, I think it was only a few pages that were kind of mixed up, and I just had to skip that part basically. But yeah, The Golden Ass in particular is also a really interesting story. It's kind of, when you explain it to a modern reader, it sounds like a comedy. This guy like messes around with a witch and he gets turned into a donkey. But I think if you read it in any degree of closeness, it's very clearly about magic and the occult and like ancient secret societies. He joins the cult of Isis at the end. Maybe there's supposed to be some elements of humor in there along the way, but I think one of the most striking elements of this text is how intimately it makes you empathize with this character. I guess it's Apuleius himself as the donkey. That's the thing. It's also like with like the travels of Sir John Mandeville and some of those like geography books that we talked about before. In the ancient and medieval world, they, I think, took these claims a little more seriously. I heard somewhere, was it maybe St. Augustine, who appears to have been under the impression that the Golden Ass was actually a real account of Apuleius messing around with a witch and then actually spending some time as a donkey, apparently. Whether we believe that or not, I certainly have trouble with that. It's certainly the case that some of the events that take place while he's a donkey are a little bit like sad. You'd think they would be like ridiculous and silly, but it talks about how, this donkey has to like stand out in the rain, and he talks about like the poor quality of the food that's given to the animals, and how, you know, under certain owners they'll feed them like slightly better food, but sometimes it's just like, I don't know, like oats or hay or slop or something that's just not fun to eat, and how, you know, owners will like mistreat and beat this donkey, and how sad Apuleius was in his life as a donkey. And then when he, you know, turns back into a human through this like religious ritual and joins the cult of Isis, it doesn't sound like a joke. It sounds like he's like saying, yep, I learned my lesson. I'm gonna become a devout follower of Isis now. And it also might be one of the best accounts we have from antiquity of a person being initiated into one of the mystery cults or mystery schools. I think he still left out all the details that he was like not allowed to share and everything, but either way, it's very interesting text. It's a bit weird. I personally didn't find it as entertaining as some of the other ones we've talked about, but yeah, also interesting. Okay, the Spanish Bawd by this guy Rojas. Let me see if I can find his full name. Yeah, Fernando de Rojas in this story, the Spanish Bawd. As I understand it, you know, kind of just looking at the blurb and like Wikipedia and stuff, this is like some kind of like hybrid novel, dialogue, play type of thing, which recounts basically some guy trying to get laid, going to a brothel and talking to the Bawd, the owner of the brothel, and I think I don't know, I haven't read it yet, but I think it might be some kind of like parody on like chivalric romances and dialogues being applied in this case to something a little bit more immoral and promiscuous. I put this here because I think that Spanish literature in general is for some reason just not talked about very much at all, at least not in kind of the same circles as people will talk about classic literature in the English speaking world. I feel like the classics of literature from the perspective of the Anglosphere, they'll talk about England first, maybe America or France second, then or maybe Russia as well, then Germany after that, then like maybe like Dante and Don Quixote. But as for like delving into the like Spanish Golden Age or even like the Italian Renaissance, for whatever reason, this just isn't talked about. Wasn't mentioned like in my entire degree at university. To be fair, they're like specializing in English literature in a lot of those departments, but even so, Don Quixote barely mentioned or not mentioned, Dante barely mentioned or not mentioned, Goethe barely mentioned or not mentioned, Tasso not even close, Boccaccio not even close, right? And so these authors of the Spanish Golden Age, you know, Lope de Vega, I don't even remember their names perfectly. This is the problem. I'll put them up on the screen. These sorts of things just aren't really talked about. From what I understand, the Spanish Bawd might have been perhaps one of like the transitional texts into that Spanish Golden Age of literature. And yeah, I think the only edition in Penguin Classics that I'm aware of is like this super old looking kind of like, at least the copy I have is like kind of beat up like this one here. So yeah, I'd say more about this, but I also haven't read like any Spanish literature, so we'll have to get around to that. Okay, Krishna, the Legend of God, the Srimad Bhagavata Purana, Book 10. So, if you have any familiarity with like ancient Hindu and Sanskrit epics, you're probably familiar with the Ramayana and maybe the Mahabharata as well. I absolutely love the Mahabharata. I'll have to do an entire video on that separately eventually. But basically, here's a nice chart from the Useful Charts YouTube channel. This is from a YouTube video. I'll try to leave a link to this as well. Hindu denominations explained. So what this graphic is explaining is like the difference between Shutri and Smriti literature in the ancient Sanskrit Hindu tradition, where the Shruti is a little bit more of like the divine revelation, the philosophical and religious ceremonial texts, and the Smriti is more in the vein of like recounting histories, storytelling, maybe kind of meant for a slightly more colloquial, or what we, probably not they, would call a secular audience. I don't think there's a concept of secular in ancient India, but all the same. So you have in this Smriti category, Smriti, I might be butchering that, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. But you also have this, I guess it's kind of like a genre called the Puranas. Now, what those are, as compared to the Ramayana and Bhagavad Gita, I have no idea. But from what I can gather, this is probably among the most accessible examples of Purana literature in English, from what I can tell. I found this book randomly, and I knew that I wanted to pick it up because I'm super interested in Indian literature and mythology. But my understanding is that this is a book from a larger epic. As you can see, it says book 10. And I don't think Penguin has published the other books. I think they've just gone with book 10. I would have to look more into that. But hey, if you've checked out the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and for some reason you're done with those and you'd like some more great Hindu epics, this is one place to look. Okay, so now we have the Roots of Ayurveda. I hope I'm not butchering this. Ayurveda. This is a collection of medical texts from ancient Sanskrit literature. This particular volume, I believe, has been reprinted in a new, style of Penguin Classics, so I don't know how rare it is, but I think this is super interesting. Occasionally, if you look at the Mortimer Adler, great works of the Western world, or maybe the Harvard Classic series, occasionally you will get scientific and medical texts highlighted as being among those great classics, the works of Newton or Copernicus or Galen, right? And so this is an example of that genre, but from the Hindu tradition, and specifically regarding the medical practices of ancient India. If you're sick and you're looking for an alternative to Western science, hey, maybe there's something in this book. I would take that with a grain of salt. I feel like, even though I'm entirely all for alternatives to Western medicine, still with a field like medicine, you still need to know what you're doing, and you're probably not going to just by reading an English translation of a selection of some texts. However, I think to switch up the genre and expand our brains beyond just poetry and drama and novels and beyond just the Western tradition, I think it could be worthwhile. At the same time, I have an edition of this. I'm probably not going to read it quite yet, or if I do, I'm probably just going to read selections from it just to start. And I've also included the Panchatantra, I hope I'm saying that right, a collection of folk tales from also the Indian tradition. Again, I don't necessarily think that this is overly rare, but like the, medical writings and the geographical writings, I feel like these series of colloquial folk tales, it's a genre of literature that sometimes gets a little bit overlooked. Other examples would include Aesop's Fables, the Tales of Aesop, Grimm's Fairy Tales. As I understand it, stories from the Panchatantra actually, traveled, and you can arguably trace some of that influence then to the 1001 Arabian Nights, and from there to Boccaccio, and from there to Chaucer. So if you're interested in any of those stories, Boccaccio, Chaucer, the Aesop's Fables, Tales of Aesop, I feel like the Panchatantra might be one of the oldest substantial versions of that kind of literature. Yeah, and then the last book I've included here are these. I think it's Penguin India's series of Kalidasa's works. There are some, I think there's the recognition of Shakuntala is available. Maybe that's in Oxford Classics edition. But in looking beyond that to Kalidasa's other works, these very, very beautiful editions of his other poems and plays and things like this are very difficult to get in North America, or really outside of India. I don't know. This is the only book on this list that I don't have, and that I'm considering, rare because of the difficulty of acquiring it. If you don't know who Kalidasa is, he is basically like the Shakespeare of Sanskrit India, where you might say that Vyasa and Valmiki, the authors of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, are more like the Homer and Virgil or Dante, right? Just using these comparisons as shorthand. Obviously that doesn't encapsulate, one-to-one comparisons. But yeah, I feel like with poets of the caliber of Kalidasa, I feel like that's pretty substantial material when studying world literature. So outside of, like I said, that Oxford Classics edition of the recognition of Sakuntala, which is a dramatization of a story from the Mahabharata, I've also turned to like the Clay Sanskrit library, right? The recognition, or excuse me, the birth of Kumara, I think it's called, is from the blurb I read, said to be, the greatest work of Kalidasa. So yeah, how much of this video was about rare penguin classics and how much of this was just an excuse to talk about Indian literature, I don't know, but we'll end it there. I think that's the point of this. I wanted to elevate and shine a light on some of these, I think, underappreciated world classics. I don't know what merit there is in comparing this one-to-one, but stories like the Nine Cloud Dream, the Song of Kieu, I don't know, maybe the Spanish Bawd, the Panchatantra, anything by Kalidasa, maybe the Puranas too, are or could be or should be, considered on par with some of the greatest works in the Western tradition. And while as, English speakers or European descended people or westernized people, variously, however you categorize that, it might be difficult for us to immediately draw one-to-one from these older cultures, older stories from other sides of the planet. And of course, we've got to be aware that, unless you speak the native language or live there, there's always going to be, and even if you do, a significant barrier to your ability to understand like the esoteric and the deeper meanings of the text. But with a little bit of humility, it's also an opportunity to richly and deeply grow, expand your horizons beyond the Christian, Western, Enlightenment, American, British traditions, which, I don't know, looks like they're kind of folding in on themselves nowadays. So anyway, with that out of the way, thank you, Orpheus, for the inspiration of this video. Check his stuff out if you haven't. Thank you guys for watching all the way to the end. You can subscribe for more stuff about world literature. Check out links for my poetry on Substack and various other things below. Hoping you got something out of this, and I hope you have a wonderful day.